Picture yourself watching the World Cup. The ball is light, air-filled, standardized, and designed to behave predictably. Now replace it with a solid sphere of raw rubber, perhaps weighing several pounds, flying at your unprotected torso. That was the Mesoamerican ball game 3,000 years ago. A hard strike could rupture organs or break bones. But in its most famous form, you could not simply catch the ball with your hands. You had to keep it moving with your hips, thighs, or forearms. And in certain ritual games, the final whistle may have meant that someone would be offered to the gods. Playing a game could mean putting your actual life on the line. Today, we think of sports as an escape from reality, a regulated space where the worst likely outcome is a torn ligament, a suspension, or a bruised ego. For much of history, sport was not separate from the real world. It trained soldiers, spoke to the universe, displayed loyalty, settled disputes, and released violence before that violence consumed the community. The rules were often brutally simple. Start in ancient Mesoamerica, around 1400 BCE. The Olmecs, followed by the Maya, the Aztecs, and many other peoples, played different versions of a ball game that lasted for thousands of years. A descendant survives today in forms such as ulama. To play it, they needed something most of the world had never seen, a ball that bounced on its own. Mesoamerican makers harvested latex from rubber trees and mixed it with plant juices, including morning glory vines, creating a tough, elastic material centuries before industrial rubber. When Europeans later saw these balls, the way they sprang from the ground seemed almost supernatural. But the ball could behave like a weapon. A solid rubber sphere the size of a human head was essentially a bouncing cannonball. At speed, a hit to the stomach or chest could cause devastating blunt force injuries. Players protected themselves with heavy belts, pads, and yokes. The carved stone yokes found by archaeologists were probably ceremonial versions of lighter equipment used in actual play. Even with protection, stopping the ball with your body required timing, strength, and a willingness to be hit very hard. Ball courts still survive in ruins from Mexico to Honduras, often near the ceremonial center of a city. In some traditions, the court could represent an entrance to the underworld. The bouncing ball might stand for the sun, struggling across the sky before disappearing below the horizon. Each impact carried more than a score. Most matches were probably about competition, status, gambling, and entertainment. But carvings also connect ball players, captive warriors, blood, and ritual decapitation. In certain ceremonies, a defeated captive may have been killed so that his blood could feed the earth or help renew the cosmic order. It was not merely a game. It could become a cosmic mechanism. Now cross the world to ancient China. By the 3rd century BCE, people were playing Cuju, literally kickball, with a leather ball stuffed with feathers and animal hair. Some early texts connect Cuju with military training. Commanders could use it to keep soldiers quick, coordinated, and competitive without sending them into battle. Players kicked, passed, and controlled the ball while avoiding their hands. But Cuju did not remain one single game. Over the centuries, some versions became public competitions. Others became court entertainment. One famous later form used a silk net stretched between 2 tall bamboo poles, with a small opening in the center. There was no goalkeeper. The challenge was to lift the ball through that narrow target without touching the net. Imagine threading a kick through a hole high above your head, while officers or nobles watched every mistake. Stamina mattered. Precision mattered. So did discipline. Then the game reached Japan, where the court transformed it into almost the opposite. By the 7th century, Japanese aristocrats were playing Kemari. In its ceremonial courtly form, there were no opposing teams trying to crush one another, and no goal to defend. 6 to 8 players stood in a circle and tried to keep a hollow leather ball in the air using their feet. That was the whole objective. They played in elaborate robes, passing the ball gently while calling out encouragement. A graceful touch helped the next player. A careless one made everyone's task harder. When the ball touched the ground, the failure belonged to the circle. Kemari turned ball control into a display of cooperation, balance, and manners. The quality of a pass showed whether you were helping the group or showing off at its expense. The ball was no longer a weapon or a military drill. It was a test of whether powerful people could share a fragile thing without letting it fall. Medieval Europe took a different approach. If you entered an English town on Shrove Tuesday between the 12th and 17th centuries, you might find what looked less like football and more like a sanctioned riot. There was no marked pitch. The playing field could be the entire town, stretching from one village to another, through rivers, churchyards, alleys, fields, and market streets. The ball might be a freshly butchered pig's bladder, inflated by mouth, tied shut, and wrapped in leather. Imagine the smell after an hour in the mud. The objective was simple: force the bladder toward a marker at the opposite end of the settlement. Then hundreds of people descended on it. Players could wrestle, strike, drag, tackle, and trample one another. Windows broke, fences collapsed, bones snapped. In the densest crushes, people could be seriously injured or killed. King Edward II banned football in London in 1314 because of the noise and chaos. Later rulers banned it again, partly because young men were expected to practice archery instead of fighting over a bladder in the street. The kings hated it. The common people kept playing. For one day, the ordinary map of the town disappeared. Streets became a pitch. Neighbors became opponents. Rank, property, and polite behavior briefly gave way to pure, muddy force. But sometimes, organized violence served a rational purpose. In pre-colonial North America, many indigenous nations played forms of stickball, an ancestor of modern lacrosse. Among some communities, it became known as the little brother of war. The phrase was not just dramatic. Stickball could train young men for combat, honor spiritual obligations, and provide a controlled way to handle disputes before they became open warfare. Players used wooden sticks fitted with small nets to catch and throw a leather ball. Matches could involve hundreds of participants. Some accounts describe enormous fields, goals far apart, and games lasting from sunrise to sunset or continuing over several days. There were no plastic helmets, no foam shoulder pads, no ambulance beside the field. Players collided at full speed, struck one another with sticks, and fought for the ball through trees, fields, and crowds. Broken bones and severe injuries were possible, yet even a brutal match could be less destructive than a war that burned villages and killed the next generation. The game placed a boundary around violence. Inside that boundary, bodies could be hurt and a dispute could be decided. Outside it, the community might survive. Using a ball game instead of war makes a certain amount of sense, unless you are from Renaissance Florence. Then you simply combine the two. Welcome to 16th century Italy and Calcio Storico. 27 men on each side entered a sand-covered square in the center of Florence. The goal was to carry or throw the ball over the opponent's end line. The ball, however, often seemed like a minor detail. Punching, kicking, wrestling, elbowing, and choking were part of the contest. Players fought one-on-one while teammates pushed the ball through the gaps. Once a man was pinned or knocked out of the action, his opponent could leave him in the sand and move on. This was not originally a sport for criminals. It was played by Florentine citizens and nobles. Aristocrats, politicians, and even men who later became popes were said to have entered the field. In Renaissance Florence, a man of status was expected to display courage, toughness, and military virtue in public. Bleeding in the sand was evidence. Calcio Storico is still played in Florence today. Every June, 4 teams representing the city's historic neighborhoods enter the arena. There is little financial reward. The real prize is neighborhood pride and the right to say that your quarter defeated the others. The players still leave the sand bruised, exhausted, and sometimes covered in blood. Look back across these 3,000 years, from the heavy rubber balls of Mesoamerica to the elegant circle of Kemari and the violent sand of Florence, and the modern game begins to look strange. We added referees, fixed boundaries, medical staff, protective equipment, governing bodies, instant replay, and pages of rules explaining exactly how much violence is allowed. We turned the ball into a toy, but for much of history it was something more useful and more dangerous. It could represent the sun, discipline an army, test cooperation, suspend the social order, absorb a conflict, or prove that a nobleman was willing to bleed in public. One object. Completely different worlds. Watching the World Cup, it is easy to think that people have always gathered around a ball for the same reason, to see who wins. But winning was sometimes only the surface. Beneath it were gods, armies, villages, political power, and one of the oldest human urges of all, the need to divide into sides and fight over something everyone agrees matters. Today, when the whistle blows, the game ends, and you get to go home. For much of history, the game was already part of what decided whether home survived.